When I walked into the bank that Tuesday morning, my son-in-law didn't even bother lowering his voice. "He's here to beg for an extension," he told the loan officer, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear, and my daughter laughed behind her hand like it was the funniest thing she'd heard all week. I didn't answer them. I found a seat near the window and waited, the way I'd waited on 100 surveillance details 30 years ago. Then the branch manager walked out from behind the glass partition, looked down at the folder in her hands, looked up at me, and every trace of professional composure drained out of her face. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, and her voice had changed completely. "I need you to come back to my office right now." My daughter's smile disappeared like someone had switched off a light. "I'm grateful you're here with me for this one. Before we get into it, tell me, son, daughter, where are my night owls and early risers listening in from this evening? I read every single comment, I promise you that. This story has some fictional elements woven in for the sake of the lesson, but the truth underneath it is real enough to matter. Let me take you back to where it started. For 11 years, every Thanksgiving looked the same. I'd drive the 40 minutes from my place on Larkspur Road out to Gregory and Renee's house in Sugar Hollow, and I'd bring the same dish I always brought my late wife Colleen's sweet potato casserole, the one with the pecans she used to toast herself in a cast-iron skillet. The recipe written on an index card, so soft from handling you could barely read her cursive anymore. I'd carry it in both hands like it mattered, because to me it did. And every year, it sat at the far end of the table, past the store-bought rolls and the caterer's ham, mostly untouched, while Gregory talked about numbers. Gregory Hale built subdivisions. That was the whole of him. If you want the truth, a man who measured his own worth in square footage and pre-sale contracts. He married my daughter Renee 16 years ago in a ceremony that cost more than my house, and somewhere in those 16 years, Renee had learned to laugh at his jokes a half-second before they landed, the way people do when they've decided which side of a marriage they're going to live on. That Thanksgiving, Gregory set his phone face down on the table, which in my experience always meant a man was about to say something he wanted witnessed. "Meadowbrook Crossing, unquote," he said. 68 units, and we haven't even broken ground on Phase 2. This time next year, we're not doing Thanksgiving in a house this size. Renee lifted her wine glass and toasted him from across the table, and I looked down at my plate, at the casserole cooling 12 feet away like something nobody had thought to introduce to the room. My grandson Miles was the only one who ever looked at me when he spoke. He was 16 that year, tall like his grandmother's side of the family, with Colleen's exact shade of hazel eyes. "Grandpa Ray, you still coming to my meet on Saturday?" Regional prelims. My chest loosened, just a little, the way it always did when that boy talked to me like I was still a person and not a place setting. "Wouldn't miss it," I told him. "You been working on your start?" He grinned and started to answer, and Gregory cut across the table without even glancing up. "Miles, don't bother your grandfather with that. He's tired." The grin didn't vanish all at once. It faded slow, like somebody turning a dial down by degrees, somebody who knew exactly how far to push it. Renee didn't look at her son when she backed her husband up. "He's right, sweetheart. Let Grandpa rest. I had things I wanted to say. That I wasn't tired. That I'd driven myself to my own cardiology appointment that week with no help from either of them. That I had sat in the stands for every one of Miles's meets since he was 9 years old and had no intention of stopping. I had all of it loaded and ready. Instead, I picked up my fork and went back to my plate. That was my mistake. I understand now. Not the casserole, not the drive out there every year. The mistake was the fork, the small, daily surrender that had gone on so long it didn't feel like a choice anymore. It felt like weather. 3 days later, Gregory knocked on my door for the first time in almost a year. I knew it was him before I even looked. 2 hard raps, evenly spaced. The knock of a man who believes his time costs more than yours and wants you to understand that before he says a word. I was at my kitchen table with black coffee and the crossword, and I folded the paper and took one slow breath before I got up. He was holding a bottle of bourbon, something with a wax seal and a price tag he hadn't quite managed to peel all the way off. "Ray," he said, catching the slip and smiling the wide, rehearsed smile he used on lenders. Figured we were overdue. He knew I didn't drink. Hadn't since my bypass 5 years back, and I'd said as much at Christmas dinner, in front of the entire family. Gregory remembered everything that might one day be useful to him. This bottle wasn't a gift. It was a costume. I let him in, set the bourbon on the counter, and poured myself more coffee without offering him any. He sat down at my table without being asked, the way men do when they've never once doubted a room belonged to them. Ray, I'm going to level with you, because I think that's the kind of relationship we ought to have. I wrapped both hands around my mug and waited. Meadowbrook's Phase 2 is the opportunity of a lifetime. I need to close on the land parcel by the end of the month or I lose the option entirely, and the bank's being slow walking my draw request. He spread his hands out on my table, a gesture meant to conjure abundance out of thin air. It's a short-term liquidity gap. 90 days, maybe less. I put up 200,000. I hand you back 320. That's 60%, Ray. You will not find that anywhere else at your age, at my age. He slid it in soft, like a compliment, the same way Gregory slid everything in. And the collateral, I said. The house on Larkspur. He said it like it was obvious. You own it outright. It's just sitting there. All you do is let me put a small lien against it till the draw clears. And then it's gone, clean as it started. I looked at him across my own table, the sweat starting at his temple, the way his right hand had begun tapping the wood in a slow rhythm. Index, middle, ring, over and over. A man burning through the last of his composure, and I thought about Colleen, who had looked at this man across an altar and decided he was worth our daughter's whole life. I wondered, not for the first time, what she'd have made of watching him ask me to hand over the last solid ground I had. Gregory, I said, keeping my voice level. I'm 68 years old. This house exists for 2 reasons, my medical bills and my peace of mind. A lien on it is neither of those things. The answer is no. The shift in his face wasn't dramatic. Gregory was too controlled for dramatic, but the smile dropped by exactly the degree that politeness no longer required, and something cold slid down behind his eyes like a shade being pulled. Unbelievable, he said quietly. He stood, and his voice pulled tight like wire wound past its limit. After everything this family's done for you. You know what you are, Ray. You're a selfish old man who's going to die alone in that little house and leave behind nothing worth remembering. He picked up the bourbon off my counter like he might take it back, then set it down hard enough that Colleen's casserole dish beside it rattled and slid 2 inches across the counter. You'll regret this, he said, and walked out, pulling the door shut behind him with enough force to shake the floor. I sat there a long while looking at that dish, still rocking slightly before it settled. 29 years chasing white-collar fraud for the Postal Inspection Service teaches you one true thing about men like Gregory Hale. A man who's merely angry will shout and leave and stay gone. A man who's panicking comes back, and he brings something worse than a bottle of bourbon. The chest pains started that Friday, 3 in the morning, and I knew what they were before I was even fully awake. Not a heart attack, something slower and meaner. The tightening my cardiologist called stress-induced angina. Manageable, he'd told me. As long as I kept the stress manageable. I sat up, pressed 2 fingers to my sternum, and breathed through it. Bad enough to be careful. Not bad enough to have strangers coming through my door at 3 in the morning. I called Renee. It rang 5 times before she picked up, her voice thick with something that wasn't quite sleep. Dad. Not a question. A statement. Already tired of me. Honey, I'm not feeling right, I said, keeping my voice steady. Because I'd learned a long time ago that sounding scared makes people stop listening to what you're actually saying. Chest pains. Nothing terrible, but I'd rather not be alone with it. Could you drive me to the ER? The sound that came down the line I will remember for the rest of my life, not words, just a long breath, the sound of someone doing math on how much I was about to cost them. Dad, it's 3 in the morning. I have the auction committee at my house at 8. The whole committee. I cannot do this right now. If it's really bad, call 911. The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone in the dark, my hand still flat against my chest, and understood that she hadn't asked how bad it was, hadn't asked if I was scared. She'd run the numbers and decided I didn't balance. I called a rideshare instead. The driver was a young man named Deshaun with gospel music turned low on the radio, and he glanced at me once in the mirror, saw how I was holding myself, and turned the volume down without being asked. You doing all right back there? Been better, I told him. St. Vincent's, please. He drove careful the whole way, no hard turns. No sudden stops, and I watched my city slide past the window at 3 in the morning. 31 years of it. The same streets I'd worked cases out of. The same neighborhoods I'd raised Renee in. And here I was riding to the emergency room alone in a stranger's Honda. The ER got me into a bay inside 20 minutes. A nurse named Patrice hooked me to a monitor with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, and the nitroglycerin under my tongue eased the pain within minutes, spreading out and thinning like fog burning off. "Your heart looks fine, Mr. Whitfield," the attending told me around 5 that morning. "But your body's telling you something. Whatever's going on in your life, you need to get ahead of it." They held me for observation until 9. On the drive home, we passed the Cascade Day Spa on Whitmore, and there was Renee's white Range Rover, parked dead center between a BMW and a Lexus, perfectly straight, her auction committee, the whole committee, coming to her house. I watched the car until it disappeared around the corner, and something in my chest that had nothing to do with angina pulled tight and stayed there. Back at my kitchen table, glass of water in front of me, I let myself think clearly for the first time about Gregory Hale. Not with the patience I'd been practicing for years out of habit, with the part of me that used to get paid to look at a situation and see it exactly as it was. A panicking man had come to my door 4 days ago. Now I was coming home from the emergency room, alone. These were not two separate events. I opened the drawer under my counter and pulled out a plain folder I hadn't let myself look at directly in months. I understood, sitting there, that I hadn't been being careful. I'd been afraid of what I already knew. The process server came at 8:15 the following Monday. 3 even knocks, the knock of a man paid to deliver things nobody wants. He handed me a thick envelope, had me sign his scanner, and was back in his van before I'd shut the door. I carried it to my desk. On the corner sat the letter opener Colleen had given me for our 28th anniversary. Sterling, our initials on the handle, and I slid it under the flap slow, the way I'd opened every important document of my adult life, because the contents don't change based on how fast you get to them. In the matter of the guardianship and estate of Raymond Elliott Whitfield, petition for appointment of guardian of the person and estate. The petitioners, listed on line 3, Gregory Allen Hale and Renee Colleen Whitfield Hale. I read it through once, start to finish, without stopping. Then I picked up the attached evaluation, 12 pages, authored by a doctor, Marcus Feld, Ph.D., clinical psychology. According to Dr. Feld, I exhibited significant cognitive decline, an inability to manage complex financial matters, and paranoid ideation specifically directed at family members acting in my best interest. He recommended immediate appointment of a legal guardian with full authority over my finances and medical care, Marcus Feld. I turned the name over, the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath. 29 years, memorizing names, witnesses, defendants, shell company officers, accountants running from gambling debts, and Marcus Feld was not a name I'd ever crossed paths with, which meant either he was exactly what he claimed, or Gregory had found him somewhere I hadn't thought to look yet. I set the papers down and looked at the framed photograph on my desk. Renee, at 8 years old, in the back seat of my old Ford, eyes red from crying, her Little League cap crooked on her head. A girl named Ashley had told the whole 3rd grade Renee's drawings were ugly, and Renee had held it together at school and on the bus, and the second she climbed into my car, she'd come apart completely, silent shaking, the kind of crying too deep for sound. I'd driven for half an hour without a word, just let her cry herself out, and when it finally slowed, I looked at her in the mirror and asked, "You know what we do when somebody tries to make us small?" She wiped her face on her sleeve. "What?" "We outlast them." She'd thought about that a long moment, then nodded the way 8-year-olds nod when they've decided to believe something all the way down. I picked the petition back up and walked across the yard to the main house. They were on the back patio, exactly where I expected. Renee stretched on a lounge chair in a white cover-up, sunglasses pushed up into her hair. Gregory, at the outdoor bar, pouring something amber over ice. They looked, the both of them, like an advertisement for a life that belonged to somebody else. Renee saw the envelope in my hand and went very still, not surprised, prepared. The stillness of someone who's been waiting for a specific thing to arrive. "Dad," she said, careful, measured. "What is this?" I held it up. Gregory crossed his arms, arranged his face into practiced concern, eyebrows drawn just so. Ray, he said, we were going to talk to you before the hearing. We didn't want you finding out this way. What is this, Gregory? After the hospital last week, we're worried about you. You're confused sometimes. You forget things. You could have called one of us, but you went alone at 3 in the morning. That's not sound judgment. My jaw tightened. I called Renee. She hung up. Renee looked away toward the pool, her fingers curling around the edge of the lounge chair. She didn't argue. That silence told me everything it needed to. The point is, Gregory went on, his voice smoothing out like water finding its way through a crack. You need someone looking after your affairs before something happens that can't be undone. We're doing this because we love you. I looked at my daughter. This paper says your father's incompetent, Renee. Is that what you believe? She turned her head and looked at me, and what was in her face wasn't guilt, wasn't defiance. It was a decision already made, settled, sitting behind her eyes like furniture she'd stopped noticing years ago. It's what's best, Dad, she said. We love you. Gregory raised his glass in a small, contemptuous salute. See you in court, Ray. And I'll be honest, I really don't think you can afford a decent lawyer. I looked at him a long moment, then turned and walked back across the lawn without hurrying. Behind me, I heard the ice click in his glass. They thought they were watching a man retreat. They thought they were watching the end of something. Walking back, I understood something I'd been circling for weeks without admitting it out loud. The only reason any of this had gone on as long as it had was because I'd allowed it to. Back inside, I stood in my quiet kitchen and looked at the closet in the back room behind the old suits I hadn't worn in years, behind everything I'd put away, a door I hadn't opened in 5 years. I walked toward it. Renee had been through that back room maybe 4 times in 7 years, always briefly, always with the particular impatience of someone visiting a place she considered beneath her notice. Gregory had never made it past the living room. Neither of them had ever thought to look, because neither of them had ever thought I mattered enough to hide anything worth finding. That was their first mistake. It was also their last. I pushed the suit rack aside on its rail, pressed my palm flat against the reader mounted to the back wall, and the biometric lock read my print in 2 seconds, a green light blinking once before the deadbolt slid back with a sound like a vault door. Inside 2 monitors, a server tower humming low and steady, a wall of locked file cabinets labeled in my own handwriting by case number and year, a secure line I'd kept active since I left the service. I'd built that room the 2nd year after Colleen died, when I understood the silence in that house was going to either swallow me whole or become useful. I chose useful. I sat down at the console and looked at the photograph taped to the bottom edge of the center screen. Colleen, in 1989, standing in front of our first house on Ferris Street, squinting into the sun, laughing at something I'd said I couldn't remember anymore. I let it go too long, Colleen, I said quietly to the picture. Then I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in 5 years, one that lived in my memory without effort. It rang twice. Priya Anand. Priya, it's Ray Whitfield. The pause was exactly 3 seconds. I counted. Mr. Whitfield, my God, my father talks about you constantly. How is he? Stubborn. Healthy. Still sore he didn't crack the Delacroix case before I did. A brief warmth in her voice, and then it sharpened straight to steel. What's happened? I've been served a guardianship petition. My daughter and son-in-law are the petitioners. There's a psychological evaluation attached from a doctor. Marcus Feld. Who's Marcus Feld? That's what I need you to find out. When did you get it? This morning. Hearing date? I flipped to the last page. 3 weeks. A shorter pause this time. The pause of someone already 3 moves ahead. All right. I need to say this before we go further. Taking this means I'm going up against whoever your son-in-law's hired on 3 weeks' notice in a courtroom that doesn't know either of us. I understand what I'm asking you to trust me with. I know exactly what I'm asking of you too, I said. Then I'll be there tomorrow morning, 9 sharp. One more thing, Mr. Whitfield, this Marcus Feld. You've never met him. Never had contact, medical, professional, social. Never heard the name in my life until this morning. The sound she made wasn't quite a laugh. The sound of someone spotting something in the distance and recognizing exactly what it was. Interesting, she said. See you tomorrow. I turned to the monitors and typed the name Marcus Feld into the first of 3 databases I still had access to, not because anyone had forgotten to close the door behind me when I retired, but because, in federal systems, Doors like that don't close unless somebody specifically orders it, and nobody had ever thought to order mine shut. I wasn't going to touch a single thing I wasn't entitled to look at. I was simply going to look at what was already sitting there in plain sight. The results came back in under 4 seconds, and cold blue light threw itself across my face as I leaned in, and for the first time since Gregory had walked through my door with that bourbon, something inside me went still and clear. Marcus Feld was not a psychologist, not a psychiatrist, not any kind of licensed clinician at all. He had been, until 11 years ago, a chiropractor. His license had lapsed after a malpractice settlement nobody had ever made public. Priya arrived at 9 the next morning in a rented gray sedan, the kind of car that disappears in any parking lot, a single scuffed laptop bag over her shoulder, instead of anything designer. She shook my hand hard at the door, scanned my living room once with the same quick cataloging eyes her father had, and then her gaze found the open door at the back of the closet, the monitors, the file cabinets, the hum of the server. She stood there a moment, taking it in, and when she turned back to me, it wasn't surprise on her face. It was something closer to respect. "They have no idea who they're dealing with, do they?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Sit," I told her. "I'll show you what I found last night." She sat, opened her laptop, connected to her firm's server in under 30 seconds, and I slid the petition across the desk, with Feld's evaluation stapled on top. She scanned it fast, the way people do when they read dense documents for a living, and stopped cold at the signature block. Her jaw tightened once, then smoothed back over. "Marcus Feld, Ph.D., Clinical Psychology," she read aloud. "He's not licensed for anything, is he? He's a chiropractor whose license lapsed in a malpractice settlement," I said. "Never treated a psychiatric patient in his life." That night, after Priya left, I sat alone at the console and pulled the last thread I'd been avoiding Colleen's Memorial Scholarship Fund, the one she'd set up for graduating seniors at the elementary school, where she'd taught reading for 31 years. 3 checks in the last 8 months, signed out of that account, totaling $280,000. Renee's signature on every one, the payee on all 3. Hale Development Group. My eyes burned, and it wasn't the night air, because I was inside. I'd lost Colleen 5 years earlier, and that grief was a country I'd learned to live in. I knew its roads, its seasons, the particular silence of Sunday mornings. But what I felt sitting at that desk looking at my daughter's signature on 3 checks drawn against her dead mother's name was a different kind of loss entirely. Not death. A choice Renee had made with clear eyes and a steady hand, apparently for months. I sat with it until the tightness in my chest eased enough to breathe around, and then I picked the phone back up, because grief was still going to be there in the morning, and there was work to do first. I made one more call that night, to a man named Dwight Calloway, who I hadn't spoken to in 6 years. 30 years back, I'd sat across a table from Dwight in an interview room and told him the truth about his own case, that he was being framed for a wire fraud scheme he had no part in, that somebody had used his credentials to move money in the weeks before his firm collapsed, and I'd spent 3 nights alone with the records to prove it before the charges against him were ever filed. Dwight built Calloway Ventures into one of the biggest private lending outfits in the region after that. He'd called me once, years later, and said, "If you ever need anything in this life, you call this number." I'd never used it until that night. "Dwight, it's Ray Whitfield." A pause, then real warmth. "Ray, I was starting to think you'd disappeared for good. I don't have time to ease into it. I need to talk about a loan in your portfolio. Borrower named Gregory Hale, Meadowbrook Crossing." A pause, more careful now. "You know him? He's my son-in-law, and he's currently trying to have me declared incompetent, using your capital call as the pressure that made it necessary." I laid it out flat, the cost overruns, the contractor liens, the falsified liquidity statements on his original application. "You're not getting that money back the way the project's structured now, Dwight." Silence, then the sound of a man doing quick math. "What do you need, Ray?" "I want to buy the note. All of it. The default position, the collateral rights, everything Calloway Ventures holds against Gregory Hale and Hale Development Group. I want to be his only creditor." "Ray, that paper's worth—" "I'm not buying it as an investment. I'm buying it as a remedy. Full outstanding principal. Wired tonight from a trust. Clean. No negotiation. The pause that followed was 4 seconds. I counted. You saved my life once, Dwight said finally, quiet in a way I'd never heard from him. Everything I built after Callaway Ventures, none of it exists without those 3 nights you spent in that records room. I'm not finished, Dwight. He cleared his throat. The answer's yes. My legal team executes tonight. A pause. Whatever you're about to do to that man, Ray, do it right. I intend to, I said. The hearing came 3 weeks later, in a courtroom on the 4th floor, with a judge named Constance Ferris presiding, a woman with reading glasses pushed low on her nose, and the flat patience of someone who has watched every kind of person lie under oath and stopped being surprised by any of them years ago. Gregory's attorney called Marcus Feld first, and Feld testified to his credentials careful and vague, the way a man does when he's reciting something memorized rather than lived. Significant cognitive decline, inability to manage complex financial decisions, paranoid ideation directed at family members. He never once looked at me. When his attorney sat down looking satisfied, Priya rose, picked up a single sheet of paper, and walked toward the stand at an unhurried pace that in a courtroom means exactly the opposite of unhurried. "Good morning, Mr. Feld," she said. "Not doctor. We'll get to that." Gregory's attorney was on his feet objecting before she'd finished the sentence, and Judge Ferris cut him off without raising her voice. "Sit down, counselor. The witness has been qualified by the petitioners." Cross proceeds. Priya turned back to Feld. "On what date did you conduct your evaluation of Raymond Whitfield?" Feld's fingers tightened in his lap. The assessment was comprehensive in nature. "A date, Mr. Feld. Month, day, year. At what location your office? His home, a clinical facility." His mouth opened and closed. A thin shine of sweat appeared at his hairline. "You've never met Raymond Whitfield," Priya said. "Not once. Not clinically. Not informally. Not in passing. Is that correct?" "I was provided with materials." She turned to the bench. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter a signed declaration from Mr. Whitfield confirming he has never had any contact with this witness, and I'd like to ask Mr. Feld to confirm under oath that his evaluation was based entirely on 3 photographs taken without Mr. Whitfield's knowledge outside a pharmacy, supplied to him directly by the petitioner." The courtroom went very still. Judge Ferris took off her glasses and set them down with a small, precise click. "Mr. Feld, you are under oath. Did you conduct a direct examination of the respondent, or did you not?" His hands were shaking openly now. He looked at his own attorney, who gave him nothing. He looked at Gregory, whose jaw had gone tight enough to see the muscle move from across the room. "I was given photographs," he said finally, barely above a whisper, "and a written description of behaviors. I was told direct examination wasn't possible." "You diagnosed a man you have never met," Judge Ferris said, "based on photographs taken without his knowledge." Priya placed her single sheet on the projector, and a wire transfer appeared on the wall, sharp and legible from Hale Development Group to Marcus Feld, $18,000, dated 9 days before the petition was filed. Memo line reading, "Consulting Services." A small, strangled sound came from Renee's direction. Not quite a word. Judge Ferris looked at the bailiff. "Take Mr. Feld into custody. Perjury and filing a fraudulent instrument with this court." She watched the handcuffs go on with the expression of a woman noting down a data point, then turned to Gregory's attorney, whose papers were no longer arranged in a neat stack. "Counselor, your primary witness has just been arrested in my courtroom. I strongly suggest you consider what you'd like to do next." He stood anyway and called Gregory to the stand, and Gregory walked up with his chin level, the walk of a man who'd spent 20 years selling people on the idea that confidence and honesty were the same thing. "Why did you file this petition, Mr. Hale?" his attorney asked, gentle now. "Because I care about my father-in-law," Gregory said. Warm, practiced. We watched him grow confused, isolated. He ended up in the emergency room alone at 3 in the morning and didn't even call us until it was already happening. That's when we knew we couldn't wait any longer. His attorney sat down, relieved. Priya rose. She didn't raise her voice either. She simply laid, one at a time, onto that same projector. "The $800,000 bridge loan request with my house as collateral. Denied." The Callaway Ventures default notice, dated the week before the petition was filed, showing Gregory Hale personally liable for $11 million with no path to cure. And last, The 3 canceled checks from a dead school teacher's memorial scholarship fund. My daughter's signature on every one, made out to Hale Development Group. Mr. Hale, Priya said, would you describe this petition as motivated by concern for your father-in-law's welfare, or by the fact that you are $11 million in default to a creditor who, as of last week, is Mr. Whitfield himself? The color left Gregory's face the way water leaves a drain. Judge Ferris looked at him over the top of her glasses for a long moment, and then she looked at Renee, sitting rigid in the gallery with both hands pressed flat against her knees, and something in the judge's expression softened by one single degree, not for Gregory, but for the daughter who still hadn't said a word. Petition denied, Judge Ferris said. And Mr. Hale, I'd advise you retain separate counsel from your wife going forward, because I don't believe your interests remain aligned. The gallery was dead silent. I didn't feel triumph sitting there. I felt tired, the particular tiredness that comes after carrying something correctly for a very long time. I foreclosed on everything Callaway Ventures held collateral against. Inside of 2 weeks, the house in Sugar Hollow, both vehicles, the LLC holdings, all of it, executed clean and quiet through Priya's office with no warning given, because I'd learned 30 years ago that warning a cornered man only gives him time to hide what matters. Of what came back to me, I split it 3 ways. The largest share went into the scholarship fund Renee had drained from her mother's account, restored in full, plus what the missed interest would have earned. The second portion, $200,000, went into a trust for Miles, locked until his 25th birthday, with a single instruction attached: use it for something that lasts. I signed those papers in Priya's office on a gray afternoon in November, and on my way out I stood in the lobby and called my grandson. Grandpa Ray, how's the ankle? He'd rolled it at regionals. I'd been in the stands, front row, and hadn't looked away once. Better, he said. Coach says I'm cleared for state. Good, I told him. Miles, I wanted you to know I set something aside for you. You'll hear the details when the time's right. A pause. Grandpa, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. That's not why I did it. Your grandmother would have wanted you standing on something solid. I'm just making sure you are. The line went quiet, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, rougher at the edges. Thank you, he said, for everything. Go win state, I told him. She came in March, on a Saturday morning. The kind of day my city can't decide what season it wants to be: cool air, sudden sun, the first buds out on the dogwoods in the park across from my building. I'd been up since 5:30 with coffee and the crossword, in the particular quiet of a man who's learned, finally, to need less. The knock came at 8:45, 3 light taps, a pause, and I knew it was her before I even reached the door. She was wearing a volunteer smock from Cedarbrook Memory Care, no makeup, her hair pulled back plain, her hands the one vanity she'd shared with her mother red and rough at the knuckles now. She looked hollowed out in the particular way that means something unnecessary has finally been removed. Come in, I said. She stepped inside, looked around without a single comment on the size of the place, which the old Renee would never have managed. She walked to the window instead and looked out at the park. Why, she said, and her voice had lost every bit of its careful modulation. You knew back in June. You could have stopped us before I ever signed anything. I see, I see. What would you have learned? I asked her. If I had. She opened her mouth, closed it again. You would have called me paranoid, I said. You'd have believed whatever Gregory told you next. You'd have found another way to get him the money. The only way you were ever going to see it clearly was to live all the way through it. A muscle worked in her jaw. She turned back to the window. I know, she said, barely audible. I know I did it. I went to my desk and opened the bottom drawer, where a small envelope had been waiting since the week Colleen died white, gone slightly yellow at the edges, sealed with the kind of care that means somebody pressed it shut with both hands and held it there a while. Colleen's handwriting on the front, for Renee, when the time is right. 5 years I'd been deciding when that was. I held it out. She crossed the room and took it the way you take something that might break, and I watched her face while she read, watched the careful blankness she'd been holding all morning come apart slowly, and then all at once. 4 sentences, in Colleen's hand. Renee, your father is the strongest man I have ever known. Not because he never broke, but because every time he did, he put himself back together for us. Don't ever mistake his silence for weakness. It never was, Renee pressed the letter flat against her chest with both hands and closed her eyes, and the sound that came out of her had no performance in it at all, raw and broken and completely honest, the way she'd cried in the back of my car 30 years ago on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I didn't move toward her. It wasn't all the way right yet between us, and she deserved the honesty of that more than she deserved comfort I didn't fully mean. I let her cry until the worst of it passed. When it quieted, I picked up a second envelope off the counter, a card with an address on Ridgeline Street inside, a studio apartment 11 minutes from Cedarbrook by bus, 3 months' rent already paid, a transit pass tucked behind it. After that, I said, "You're on your own." She looked at the card, then up at me, searching for something forgiveness, maybe, or just her father, plain and whole. I gave her what I actually had, which is the kind of love that doesn't soften the truth, but stays in the room while you face it anyway. "The ledger's clear," I told her. She nodded, folded both envelopes into her smock pocket, and walked to the door, and left without looking back, not because she didn't want to, but because she'd finally understood the next step only went forward. I stood at the window a long while after she'd gone, watching the dogwoods move in the morning wind, and then I sat down with my coffee, cold by then, and drank it anyway. My name is Raymond Whitfield. I've retired twice, once from the work, and once, much later, from being invisible in my own family. The ledger's balanced now. For the first time in longer than I can honestly tell you, I'm not waiting on anything anymore. I've carried this story a long while before telling it to anyone. People ask me what I actually learned. From the Thanksgivings where I sat at the far end of a table nobody looked at. From the emergency room at 3 in the morning alone. From that courtroom. From my daughter's face reading her mother's handwriting. Here's the honest answer. I learned that silence isn't the same thing as peace. For years I told myself I was being patient, being gracious, being the bigger man about it. What I was actually doing was teaching everybody around me that they could treat me like less than I was, and I was the one holding the pen the whole time and never once picked it up. Don't do what I did. Don't let the people you love, or the people who just happen to share your last name, mistake your quiet for the absence of a limit. The ledger balances eventually. It always does. The only real question is whether you're the one holding the pen when it finally does. Even at 68, especially at 68, a man is still owed his dignity, and dignity was never meant to be spent quietly in a corner, waiting for somebody to notice you're still standing in it. If you've ever sat at the far end of a table and felt like a piece of the furniture nobody remembered where to put, I think you already understand what this cost me and what it gave back. Tell me in the comments, son, daughter, friend, what would you have done differently in my place? Share it with somebody who needs to hear it tonight. And if you believe real strength is simply knowing when to finally pick the pen back up, stay close, because I've got more of these to tell you.